Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing and bringing more attention to this. We must bring back Pastor Saeed Abedini. I think that many people have spoke eloquently about human rights, religious freedom, and all of that is absolutely true. But even if none of those issues were at stake, he's an American citizen. This is an attack not just against him and his family, but an attack against all of us. And this from a regime that's, since its very inception, has exhibited abuse after abuse, attack after attack against the U.S. and our citizens. They detained over 400 embassy personnel after the initial Islamic Revolution. They were complicit in the Beirut bombing of 1983, which killed over 200 U.S. Marines. And of course, they were coordinating and perpetrating attacks against our service members in Iraq. Not to mention, of course, the citizens of the United States, not just Pastor Saeed Abedini, but Bob Levinson, Amir Hekmati. This is something that is going to the heart of all of us, and so I want this to be an issue that is dealt with at the highest levels. And I was very discouraged when Secretary Kerry said that they had not raised the issue in the context of these nuclear negotiations, which obviously was many of the people on both sides of the aisle had some serious concerns about. But let me ask you, Ms. Abedini, you had mentioned that when you initially talked to the State Department, they said there was nothing they could do. Who was it at the State Department that basically said there was nothing they could do?
I don't think I can mention names, but I think it was at the lower, it was the, what's the contact?
It's a desk officer. It's Loy Howe. She was the first to state that they could not offer any assistance. And again, I mean, this is the staff level. They're getting direction from others.
And to Secretary Kerry's credit, as soon as he found out, he immediately put out a statement. But the idea that the bureaucracy would be that dismissive when you have a U.S. citizen in jeopardy like that, that's been essentially kidnapped by a totalitarian regime, there's some major issues going on there. And so I was very discouraged to read your testimony and to be reminded of the fact that you had actually gone. And I just think our bureaucracy has got to be very responsive to that. That's a very important issue. Mr. Sekulow, I guess part of this is in 2009, you had this green movement that was very promising. And so some of these countries like Egypt, you don't know what's going to end up happening. There's pluses and minuses to people like Hosni Mubarak. But when you're in Iran, it can't get any worse. So any speaking out against the regime is something that I think the U.S. should support. The administration purposely did not back that, did not provide any even rhetorical support. And I think the reason is that the President was looking to have better relations with the regime, and he thought that that would jeopardize that. And so I'm wondering, is there a concern that that this zest for a deal on paper may cause the administration to not put forth as much effort on some of these human rights cases that could, quite frankly, complicate the quote-unquote deal?
Congressman DeSantis, I would say the administration did just that. I mean, they missed the preconditions to negotiations where they could have handled this with Iran before sitting down on the nuclear issue and economic relief and say, hey, you've got 3 of ours. I mean, we were talking about broader human rights in Iran. That's a long-term strategy. But why we're here today is because of 1 American of 3 who are being held. As you said, that's egregious enough. That we didn't have to have a whole agreement on a new human rights scheme inside Iran for Iranian citizens to get to the next step. We needed to get 3 Americans home, and the administration missed that opportunity. Then Secretary Kerry came before the Foreign Affairs Committee, of which his subcommittee is a part of, and said it will not be part of the nuclear negotiations. Some have said it's on the margins, but he was not really clear on if that's even the case or if he is informed of that being the case. And so what we are concerned is that this administration is so focused on appeasing Iran, who has threatened even this Congress, if you enact sanctions, new sanctions to pull out of these agreements, that we missed the best opportunity. Iran's hurting from the sanctions, we know that. The regime hurts because of that. And yet we did not demand the return of three Americans not a new human rights scheme in Iran. That is a long-term plan that Dr. Sweat and others would need to work on. I mean, but this was the return of 3 Americans, and the administration, I do believe, has sacrificed them and has betrayed them. And we've used that word because we know they had an opportunity that did not exist. I was trying to make that clear to Congressman Deutsch. That opportunity didn't exist before, Congressman DeSantis. We know that. We weren't sitting down at the table with the foreign minister of Iran. Our president wasn't on the phone. But now we are, and we're still, and this has been a problem with the State Department, our bureaucracy, we're still living in 2012 mindset that we have no diplomatic relation, when we all can read a newspaper. You don't have to have a security clearance to know that these meetings are occurring. And so, yes, we're very concerned that if we don't continue to speak out and Congress doesn't make it clear, as it has throughout this process, the only time we've gotten a response back from this administration, I'll close with this, it's never been proactive. It's reactive. When President Obama made the phone call, and then they said, well, he also brought up Said, it was the day after the 1-year anniversary of Said's imprisonment. I was at a prayer vigil outside the White House. Naghmeh was at a prayer vigil, and boy, they were happening around the country. Secretary of State Secretary Clinton never spoke out, even with the media attention, congressional support. And then Secretary Kerry basically promised during his confirmation hearings to Senator Rubio that he would, but he didn't until after the Lantos Commission hearing. And by the way, none of that has been vocal. These have been 2 written statements from Secretary Kerry. Even when asked about it directly, he'll never use the name. And then President Obama has also not spoken out. And so at a time, and then we're told, well, because they become pawns and hostages. But Congressman Deutsch used the word himself about, he already called them. They already are hostages. And so we are extremely concerned that we missed one huge opportunity, and that, again, we would just hope that in this confidential briefing, classified briefing, to learn, so that we know from you that it's not just reactive, the public, but that there is proactive work being done, because that is not clear to us. Thank you, Congressman.
Well, thank you. And before I yield back, I just want to say I think that this needs to be a proactive priority, of course, for the Congress, but also for the administration. And I am skeptical whether you could ever deal with this Iranian regime, but the notion that you're going to get a nuclear agreement with a regime who will not even return a pastor who's wrongly imprisoned, give me a break. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. I yield back.
Well put, Mr.